The Veterans Heritage Hall in Norfolk, Virginia had been built to make people feel small in the presence of memory. Bronze plaques climbed the walls from floor to ceiling. Flags stood motionless beneath warm amber lights. Framed photographs of men and women in uniform watched from every direction with expressions that seemed to ask whether the country had remembered them correctly. The evening program had already begun, and the soft hum of conversation moved through the room like distant static, polite on the surface, uneasy underneath. Commander Vanessa Reed stood near the display of post-service honors with her shoulders straight and her hands relaxed at her sides, dressed in a dark tailored suit that carried the quiet precision of someone who had worn discipline longer than fashion. On the left side of her jacket, pinned just above her heart, rested the medal Officer Tyler McGrath had ordered her to remove. It did not glitter loudly. It did not beg for attention. It sat there with a weight no one in that room could measure by looking at it. For a moment after his outburst, nobody moved. That was the worst part, not the sharpness of his voice, not even the finger he had raised toward her chest, as if honor itself could be dismissed with a gesture, but the silence that followed. Some guests lowered their eyes. Others leaned closer to hear more. A woman near the dessert table pressed her lips together and said nothing. Two men in blazers exchanged a glance that carried curiosity before concern. Vanessa had seen that kind of silence before. She had seen it in briefing rooms, in airports, in country clubs, in places where the wrong people believed they could decide who looked worthy of respect. Tyler stepped closer, his expression tight with the confidence of a man who had mistaken suspicion for authority too many times. He was not yelling now. That would have been easier to dismiss. Instead, his voice came low and hard, meant to sound official, meant to sound reasonable, the way prejudice often does when it wants witnesses on its side. He said there had been complaints. He said people were confused. He said military decorations were not costumes. Then his eyes flicked to Vanessa again, taking in her dark skin, her calm face, the unshaken line of her posture, and something in his stare revealed what his words had been trying to hide all along. It was not the medal that troubled him. It was the woman wearing it. Vanessa did not reach for the pin. She did not defend herself with frantic words. She only looked at him with the kind of stillness that unsettles people who expect fear. Imagine standing there, in a room built to honor service, while a stranger decides your face does not match the story of your sacrifice. Imagine carrying years of discipline in your spine and still being asked to prove that you belong. Her chest rose slowly with one measured breath. The medal remained untouched. Across the room, an older black veteran in a charcoal suit narrowed his eyes as though searching his memory. Near the registration table, a retired Master Chief noticed the way Vanessa stood, heels planted, chin level, shoulders square, and his expression shifted from confusion to caution. He did not say her name. Not yet. But something had begun to move through the room, a subtle current, the first crack in the scene Tyler thought he controlled. Vanessa finally spoke, and when she did, her voice was calm enough to make the silence feel louder. She said, "I have worn this with the permission of every person who had the right to question it." Tyler gave a humorless laugh, but it came half a second too late. He had expected panic. He had expected apology. What he got instead was poise, and poise has a way of exposing weak men in public. Somewhere behind them, footsteps entered the hall. Slow, measured, heavy with purpose. A few heads turned. Vanessa did not. Her eyes stayed on Tyler, and for the first time that night, the certainty in his face began to slip. The footsteps did not rush. They did not need to. They carried the kind of authority that never announced itself twice, the kind that made conversations die mid-sentence and shoulders straighten before a single word was spoken. One by one, heads turned toward the entrance of Veterans Heritage Hall, and the hush that had settled over the room deepened into something heavier, something watchful. Officer Tyler McGrath noticed it too. Vanessa could see the change in his eyes before he even looked over his shoulder. It was small at first, only a flicker, but it was enough. Enough to tell her that the room was no longer fully his. Near the doorway stood a tall man in dress whites, his silver hair cut close, his posture so precise it looked carved from old discipline. He had not yet stepped fully into the center of the hall, and still the air around him shifted the room. Beside him, two local officials who had been smiling moments earlier now looked unsure of where to place their hands. Tyler swallowed and tried to regain control of the moment by doing what men like him always do when certainty begins to crack. He doubled down. He turned back to Vanessa and lowered his voice even more, as if dignity could be quietly stripped away and somehow become acceptable. He told her she was causing a disturbance. He said if she had any respect for the military, she would remove the medal voluntarily and clear up the misunderstanding. Misunderstanding. The word landed between them like an insult dressed up in manners. Vanessa had spent enough years in uniform to recognize that language. It was the language of people who feared saying the truth plainly. The truth was that Tyler had looked at a black woman wearing honor and decided honor must be misplaced. The truth was that he had not questioned the medal because of protocol. He had questioned it because of her. Vanessa let the silence sit there for a beat longer than he wanted. Then she glanced down, not with shame, but with the quiet gravity of someone looking at a grave marker. That medal had never belonged to applause. It belonged to names. To long nights over dark water. To radio static. To a cold wind that smelled like fuel and salt. To men whose voices she could still hear in memory, even when the room around her was perfectly still. A medal is a small thing when seen from a distance. A pin. A ribbon. A bit of metal catching warm light. But up close, to the person who earned it, it holds weight no scale can measure. It holds the mile after mile of training no one clapped for. It holds the call home that never came on time. It holds the sacrifice people love to praise from podiums, but often fail to recognize when it stands right in front of them in the body of a black woman who survived enough to wear it. Across the room, the retired Master Chief took one slow step forward. The older veteran in the charcoal suit followed with his eyes fixed on Vanessa now, not Tyler. A woman near the photo wall raised a trembling hand to her mouth, as if some buried recognition had begun to surface. Tyler noticed all of it, and that made him sharper, not wiser. He said he was asking one last time. Vanessa lifted her gaze back to him, calm, steady, unbent. Then, in a voice so controlled it made the whole room lean closer, she said, "The medal is not the problem, officer. What you cannot accept is who earned it." And just like that, the hall went still enough to hear the soft, measured sound of the approaching dress shoes stop behind her. For a second, no one turned around. No one breathed loudly enough to be noticed. It was as if the entire hall understood that something irreversible had just entered the room and nobody wanted to be the first to break it. Then Tyler McGrath stepped half a pace to the side, trying to square his shoulders before the man behind Vanessa fully came into view. That small movement told its own story. Confidence does not reposition itself when it is real. The man in dress whites moved forward with calm authority, every detail about him exact, from the ribbons aligned across his chest to the measured expression that did not waste itself on theatrics. Admiral Marcus Hale had spent decades in rooms where men lied for power and others stayed silent to keep it. He knew the difference between confusion and disrespect the instant he walked in. His eyes passed over Tyler only briefly before settling on Vanessa Reed, and in that single glance something old and unspoken moved between them, not familiarity in the casual sense, but recognition forged in service, in sacrifice, in the kind of work most Americans only honor from a safe distance. Around the hall, whispers started at last, low and stunned, moving like wind through dry leaves. Someone near the back said the Admiral's name under their breath. A local councilman stiffened so abruptly that his water glass trembled against the white linen tablecloth. The retired Master Chief, who had taken that cautious step forward, now stood completely still, staring at Vanessa with a dawning certainty that seemed to age his face and soften it at the same time. Tyler noticed the shift in the room and tried once more to pull it back toward himself. He cleared his throat and spoke with forced professionalism, saying that he was only following procedure, that he had been alerted to possible unauthorized military insignia, that anyone in his position would have asked the same questions. But his voice had changed. The edge was still there, yet now it dragged behind him instead of leading him. He was no longer speaking to assert authority. He was speaking to defend what he had already done. That is the thing about public humiliation when the truth begins to surface. It reverses direction. Vanessa remained where she was, one hand relaxed at her side, the other near the edge of the display case, her posture unchanged, her face unreadable except for the faint stillness in her eyes that always appeared when memory pressed too close. She did not rush to explain herself. She did not appeal to the room. She had lived too long to beg strangers to believe what her service had already proven. Imagine that kind of restraint. Imagine standing in front of plaques, flags, and folded stories of fallen Americans while a man with a badge tries to decide whether your honor looks authentic enough for public view. It was never about the medal, never about the ribbon. It was about the insult hidden beneath the question. Admiral Hale came to a stop beside Vanessa, not in front of her, not as if she needed shielding, but next to her, where respect belongs. His gaze dropped for one brief moment to the medal pinned over her heart, and the look in his eyes was not surprise. It was remembrance. He had seen that medal before, though not in a glass case, not under soft ballroom light, and not attached to ceremony. He had seen what it cost. Tyler opened his mouth again, perhaps to explain, perhaps to apologize, perhaps only to stop the silence from burying him alive beneath it. But before he could say another word, the Admiral drew one slow breath, and the hall waited. Admiral Marcus Hale did not raise his voice. Men like him never had to. When he finally spoke, the sound carried through Veterans Heritage Hall with the low, steady force of something practiced. Over decades, the kind of voice that could cut across wind on an open deck and still remain precise. He asked only one question at first. "Officer, on what grounds did you challenge Commander Reed's right to wear that medal?" Tyler McGrath straightened as if posture alone might save him. He repeated himself, more carefully now, saying that concerns had been raised, that someone had reported a possible false display of military honors, that he was only trying to protect the dignity of the event. Protect the dignity of the event. The phrase floated in the air and died there, because now the room could hear what it had missed before. Dignity had not been protected tonight. It had been tested, and not by the woman standing calmly beneath the flags. Vanessa did not move. She let the Admiral and the officer occupy the silence while the room around them slowly caught up to what it was witnessing. At the far edge of the hall, near a display of shadow boxes and folded letters, an elderly widow named Evelyn Brooks pressed one hand to the pearl brooch at her collar. She had been invited every year since her husband's passing, and she knew enough about military rooms to sense when ceremony gave way to truth. Her eyes moved from the medal on Vanessa's chest to the Admiral's face and then back again, and she whispered to no one, "Oh my God." Beside her, the retired Master Chief took another slow breath and looked more closely at the ribbon bar, the placement, the bearing, the stillness. Details began aligning in his mind the way trained things often do. The way Vanessa stood at rest without ever seeming at rest. The faint pale mark near her wrist where an old watch tin had once been darker. The deliberate way she kept her left shoulder slightly angled, not out of weakness but habit, as if years of carrying weight on one side had taught her body not to waste motion. These were not things a costume taught. These were not things a liar borrowed for a banquet. Tyler, however, was still trying to speak his way back into control. He said that if Commander Reed truly had military standing, then presenting identification should settle the matter. That was the word he chose. Truly. And in that one word, the room heard it. The hesitation. The doubt that had attached itself not to evidence, but to her existence. Vanessa let out a breath, so quiet only those nearest her would have noticed. Then she reached into the inside pocket of her jacket with slow, unhurried precision. The movement instantly tightened the room, not with fear, but with attention. She withdrew a slim leather case, worn at the fold from years of use, and held it in her hand without opening it. For a moment she looked down at it, and in her eyes something shifted, some private weather, some old ache that had nothing to do with Tyler McGrath and everything to do with all the years before him. Imagine carrying proof of your own service not because your country forgot, but because too many people kept asking for it in rooms where others were believed without question. She handed the case not to Tyler, but to Admiral Hale. That choice alone said everything. The Admiral opened it, glanced once, then closed it again with a slowness that made Tyler's face lose color by the second. He did not show the contents to the room. He did not need to. Instead, his eyes lifted back to Vanessa, and what passed across his expression was not pity, not surprise, but the heavy respect of a man remembering a cost the room had not yet earned the right to hear. The hall grew so still that even the hum of the chandelier seemed louder. Somewhere in the back, a phone that had been halfway raised for gossip was quietly lowered. Tyler's mouth parted as if to offer one more explanation. But before another excuse could reach the air, Admiral Hale turned his body fully toward Vanessa Reed, and everyone in the room understood that the next thing they were about to witness would change the entire night. Admiral Marcus Hale did not open the leather case again. He did not need to. The truth inside it had already landed where it mattered, and the room could feel that weight even without seeing a single line of print. For a long second, he simply stood there facing Vanessa Reed while the hall held its breath around them. Then something older than politics, older than ceremony, older even than the polished floor beneath their feet rose into the air between them. Memory, service, recognition. The Admiral lifted his right hand in a crisp formal salute. It was not theatrical. It was not done for the cameras or the donors or the stunned local officials frozen near the stage. It was done because honor recognizes honor. And in that instant, every person in Veterans Heritage Hall understood that the medal on Vanessa's chest had not been misplaced. It had been questioned by the wrong man. The silence that followed was unlike any silence the room had carried before. Earlier it had been cowardice, curiosity, discomfort. Now it was reverence mixed with shame. Mrs. Evelyn Brooks lowered her head and pressed trembling fingers to her lips. The retired Master Chief beside her stood straighter than he had all evening, his eyes glassy now, not from surprise, but from the realization that he had nearly watched another American warrior be diminished in a room built to celebrate sacrifice. Tyler McGrath did not know where to look. At Vanessa, at the Admiral, at the floor. His face had tightened into that rigid expression people wear when they can feel the story turning against them in public and cannot stop it. Admiral Hale lowered his salute only after Vanessa returned it with the same measured precision. Nothing rushed, nothing exaggerated, only the clean, quiet exchange of two people shaped by the same code. When her hand came down again, the motion carried with it something the room had not yet earned but was finally beginning to understand. This was not about a medal. It had never been about a medal. It was about the kind of country that asks some people for proof of dignity while handing trust to others on sight. The Admiral turned then, slowly, toward Tyler. His voice remained calm, but now every syllable struck with unmistakable force. He said Commander Vanessa Reed served this nation in places and under conditions most people in this room could not endure for a single hour. He said she had earned every ribbon, every commendation, every line in that record. He said the medal pinned over her heart was not a decoration for debate. It was a symbol of duty paid in full and at great personal cost. Tyler tried to speak, tried to say he had only responded to a concern, only tried to verify, only meant to preserve standards. But the words came apart as soon as they left him. Because standards had already entered the room, and they were standing beside Vanessa Reed in dress whites. Imagine that feeling. Imagine realizing too late that the person you doubted has already been saluted by history, while you are still fumbling for excuses. Vanessa's eyes did not burn with triumph. That would have made the moment easier for everyone else. Instead, they carried something heavier and far more difficult to ignore. Weariness. The kind that comes from winning a fight you should never have had to fight in the first place. She looked past Tyler for one brief second at the rows of flags, the memorial wall, the framed faces of the honored dead, and the memories came rushing in again like a tide she had spent years learning to stand inside. Salt in the air. The hard slap of rotor wash. A voice in her headset calling coordinates through static. A promise made to men whose names she still carried in private when no room was watching. By the time she looked back, the whole hall had changed. Not just in mood, in posture, in conscience. And Tyler McGrath, standing in the middle of it, had begun to understand that his humiliation was only the beginning. The room did not recover quickly. It could not. A formal salute in a place like that did more than correct a misunderstanding. It exposed everyone who had helped sustain it. Some by speaking, some by staring, some by doing what decent people too often do when truth is made uncomfortable. Nothing. The donors near the front table shifted in their seats and looked down at their folded programs as if the printed schedule might offer a way out of what they had just witnessed. The local councilman who had smiled so easily earlier now kept his jaw tight and his eyes fixed on the podium. Mrs. Evelyn Brooks quietly sank into the nearest chair, her face pale with the kind of sorrow that comes when a room dedicated to remembrance nearly forgot one of its own while she was still standing in it. Tyler McGrath felt all of it at once. You could see it in the way his neck stiffened, in the way his hands hovered near his belt as though habit might somehow restore the authority that had just drained from him in full view of the hall. Men like Tyler rarely imagine the moment after exposure. They picture the challenge, the suspicion, the accusation. They do not picture the silence that follows when everyone sees exactly who they have been all along. He tried again, weaker now, saying there must have been a misunderstanding, that he meant no disrespect, that he had simply received a complaint and acted in good faith. Good faith. Another phrase that sounded respectable until it touched the facts. Admiral Hale did not interrupt him. He let Tyler finish. Then he asked, in the same steady voice that had already changed the room, who filed the complaint. Tyler hesitated. It was brief, but not brief enough. Across the hall, eyes shifted toward a tall white man in a navy blazer standing beside the commemorative donor wall. Charles Whitmore had spent years moving through civic events with the smooth confidence of someone who believed generosity and reputation were the same thing. He had donated to the hall, sat on 2 boards, sponsored scholarships with his family name in gold print. And now, under the weight of the Admiral's question, his face lost its practiced warmth. He stepped forward just enough to be seen and said he had only raised a concern because the medal looked significant and he did not recognize Commander Reed from prior events. That was how prejudice often dressed itself in rooms with polished floors and catered dinners. Concern, recognition, standards. The words sounded harmless until you noticed who they were always aimed at. Vanessa looked at Whitmore without blinking. No anger, no rush to humiliate him back. Just that same unbearable calm. The calm of a woman who had long ago learned that composure could force the truth to reveal itself better than shouting ever could. Admiral Hale asked Whitmore whether he had questioned any of the other medals in the room that evening. Whitmore did not answer at first. He did not need to. Everyone already knew. Because there had been older men wearing ribbons, younger men in dress blues, a white retired colonel near the stage whose decorations had gone entirely unchallenged. No one had asked them for proof. No one had pointed at their chest in public. No one had demanded they explain how they had earned the right to be remembered. The hall seemed to lean inward on itself. Even the flags looked heavier now. Vanessa could feel the old ache in her shoulders returning, not from strain, but from memory. There were rooms overseas where danger had felt simpler than this because at least there the threat announced itself honestly. Here it came wrapped in polite language and public respectability, smiling beneath chandeliers while deciding who looked believable enough to belong. Imagine that. Surviving years of service, only to find that the hardest thing to prove back home is not courage, but legitimacy. Admiral Hale turned back toward the stage and addressed the room at last. He said Veterans Heritage Hall existed to honor sacrifice, not to audition it. He said if the country was serious about remembrance, then remembrance had to include the faces some people still found inconvenient. Black faces, female faces, quiet faces that did not fit old stories of heroism. The words hit the room harder than a shout ever could because they were spoken plainly, without ornament, without escape. And when the Admiral finished, there was no applause. Not yet. Only the long, humbling silence of people realizing the ceremony had already begun, and none of them had been prepared for the truth it would require. No one clapped because applause would have let the room off too easily. It would have turned conviction into ceremony, discomfort into performance, and what had just happened into something neat enough to survive without change. Instead, the silence remained, heavy and exposed, forcing every person in Veterans Heritage Hall to sit inside it. Tyler McGrath stood in the middle of that silence like a man suddenly aware that the floor beneath him was no longer solid. The confidence that had carried him into Vanessa Reed's space was gone now, stripped not by anger, but by the simple arrival of truth. His mouth moved once, then stopped. His eyes flicked toward Charles Whitmore, then toward the donors, then toward the local officials who only minutes earlier might have backed him with polite nods and civic concern. But now none of them moved to rescue him. That was the first real consequence. Not punishment. Isolation. Whitmore attempted one final retreat into the language of respectable prejudice, saying he had not meant offense, that he had simply wanted to preserve the integrity of the event, that in times like these people had to be careful. Careful. Vanessa heard the word and felt something in her chest settle cold and clear. Black Americans had been hearing that word for generations in rooms just like this. Be careful. Ask carefully. Doubt carefully. Exclude carefully. Humiliate carefully enough that it still sounds civilized. Admiral Hale turned his gaze on Whitmore with a steadiness that made the older man's polished composure start to crumble around the edges. He said integrity was not preserved by questioning decorated service members based on whether they fit someone's private imagination of honor. He said the event had not been endangered by Vanessa Reed's medal. It had been disgraced by the willingness of powerful people to doubt her in public and call it caution. That landed harder than anything else because it named the room itself. Not only Tyler, not only Whitmore, the room. Mrs. Evelyn Brooks rose from her chair before anyone expected her to. Her husband's folded flag had sat in her living room for 12 years, and grief had taught her to recognize what respect was supposed to look like. With quiet effort, she crossed the floor, stopping just a few feet from Vanessa. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice did not. She said, "Commander Reed, I am sorry. Not sorry for confusion. Not sorry if anyone was offended. Just sorry. The kind of apology that asks nothing back." Vanessa looked at the older woman, and for the first time that night, some of the steel in her expression softened. Not because the wound was gone, but because truth, when it finally appears in another person, can make the burden feel less lonely for a moment. One by one, others began to shift. The retired Master Chief stepped forward and introduced himself properly. A Gold Star mother near the memorial wall bowed her head to Vanessa with tears standing in her eyes. A younger veteran in dress blues, who had been silent through the whole confrontation, finally said aloud that he should have spoken sooner. And there it was, the second consequence. Not just that Tyler had been exposed, but that everyone else was now being measured by what they did after the exposure. Two uniformed officers from the city detail, who had remained at the edge of the hall while the situation unfolded, approached Tyler with a formality that said everything. They did not grab him. They did not create a scene. One simply asked him, in a low, even voice, to step outside, pending immediate review of his conduct. Pending review. The phrase was bureaucratic, but the room understood what it meant. Tyler looked like he wanted to argue, but argument requires witnesses willing to believe you. He no longer had them. As he turned to leave, no one cleared a path out of fear. They stepped aside out of judgment. And standing there beneath the amber lights, with the medal still over her heart and the hall finally seeing her clearly, Vanessa Reed watched the man who had publicly doubted her walk out carrying the full weight of his own disgrace. The doors closed softly behind Tyler McGrath, but the sound seemed to echo longer than it should have, as if the hall itself wanted to remember the moment he left. No one rushed to fill the silence after that. No one reached for easy applause or polite small talk. Veterans Heritage Hall had been forced to look at itself, and rooms like that do not recover with noise. They recover, if they recover at all, through truth. Vanessa Reed stood exactly where she had been when the night began, beneath the amber lights, beside the memorial wall, the medal still resting over her heart with the same quiet weight it had carried before anyone questioned it. Nothing about the medal had changed. Only the room had. Admiral Marcus Hale stepped back half a pace, giving the moment to her now, and every eye followed without being told. Donors, widows, veterans, city officials, volunteers, all of them waiting, not because she owed them a speech, but because they understood at last that the person they had measured all evening was the only one in the room who had never needed proving. Vanessa looked first at the wall of photographs, at the framed faces of men and women frozen in youth, in resolve, in service. Some had made it home. Some had not. Some had names remembered in ceremonies. Others were carried only in the private grief of families who still set an empty place in their hearts every national holiday. Her gaze lingered there for one long breath before she turned back to the crowd. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, steady, and clear enough to settle over the room like a hand pressing truth into place. She said she had not come that evening to make anyone uncomfortable. She had come to honor people who had served beside her, people who had given more than medals could ever hold, people whose stories deserved better than to be filtered through suspicion the moment the wrong face wore their memory in public. No one moved. Even the chandelier seemed to hum more quietly now. Vanessa said that service had taught her many things: discipline, endurance, silence when silence was needed, courage when fear would have been easier, but one lesson had followed her home more stubbornly than the rest. In America, some people wear honor and are thanked for it. Others wear honor and are asked to explain it. The words landed without force, and because of that they hit harder. Mrs. Evelyn Brooks bowed her head and wept openly now, not with spectacle, but with the exhausted sorrow of someone who knew she had just heard the truth spoken plainly in a room that had long depended on people softening it. Charles Whitmore stared at the floor. The younger veteran in dress blues held his cap against his chest. Admiral Hale did not look away from Vanessa for a single second. Imagine earning the respect of war, only to come home and still have to negotiate the respect of a ballroom. Imagine surviving the things this country praises from a distance, then discovering that what unsettles people most is not what you endured, but that you endured it while black and unbroken. Vanessa let the silence breathe one final time, then touched the metal lightly with 2 fingers, not as a display, but as a promise. When she spoke again, her last words carried through Veterans Heritage Hall with the kind of quiet that stays long after a room empties. She said, "You tried to question my honor because you could not imagine it looking like me. But honor was never yours to grant, and it was never yours to take away." And in that moment, under flags that suddenly seemed heavier and more honest than before, the room understood the real ceremony had not been about remembrance alone. It had been about recognition. Because he wore authority for an evening, she had carried truth all her life.